The Dorchester Hotel's ballroom fell silent as Rex Harrison stood up from his table, champagne glass in hand, that familiar theatrical smirk playing across his lips. It was May 15th, 1967, and London's film elite had gathered to honor humanitarian efforts in the industry. Audrey Hepburn was receiving an award for her work with children's charities, standing gracefully at the podium in a simple black dress that somehow outshone every elaborate gown in the room. Then Rex's voice cut through the polite applause, clear and cutting as only a trained classical actor could deliver it. How perfectly predictable. The pretty girl with the sad eyes saving the children? What's next, Audrey? Rescuing puppies? 200 of Britain's most powerful entertainment figures froze. The crystal chandeliers seemed to dim. Even the waiters stopped moving. Audrey stood at that podium, her delicate hands resting on the edge, and for 5 seconds that felt like eternity. Nobody knew what would happen next. But those who truly knew Audrey Hepburn understood something Rex Harrison had failed to grasp after working with her for months on My Fair Lady. Behind that ethereal exterior lived a woman forged by war, shaped by starvation, and strengthened by abandonment. What she said next wouldn't just expose Rex Harrison's cruelty. It would reveal a truth about genuine compassion that Hollywood had been quietly witnessing for years. The evening had begun like any other charity gala, all polish and performance. Audrey hadn't wanted to attend. These events always felt hollow to her, a parade of wealth disguised as generosity. She'd told the organizers no 3 times, but they'd persisted. The charity was legitimate, they argued. Real children would benefit from the visibility her name would bring. So she'd come, wearing the simplest dress she owned, her only jewelry, the pearl earrings her mother had somehow saved through the war. She sat quietly through dinner, speaking only when spoken to, her mind elsewhere, thinking about the children she'd visited that morning at Great Ormond Street Hospital. Little Timothy, who'd lost his leg to bone cancer, but still managed to smile when she'd brought him drawing supplies. Sarah, whose leukemia treatments had left her too weak to sit up, but whose eyes had lit up when Audrey had simply sat beside her bed and listened. The award presentation began with a brief film about her charitable work. Images flashed across a screen. Audrey visiting hospitals, sitting with sick children, her face free of makeup, her expression tender and focused. The narrator spoke about her regular visits, her donations, the trust funds she'd quietly established. What the film didn't show was the real story. How every Tuesday for 3 years, Audrey had driven herself to East London to visit St. Bartholomew's Children's Ward. How she'd paid for experimental treatments that families couldn't afford. How she'd held crying mothers in hospital corridors, promising them their children would receive the care they needed, regardless of cost. Rex Harrison sat at his table, watching the tribute film with barely concealed disdain. To him, Audrey represented everything shallow about modern cinema. She wasn't a trained actress, hadn't studied at RADA, hadn't paid her dues in regional theater. She was a model who'd gotten lucky, a pretty face who'd charmed audiences without earning the right to their admiration. Their history ran deeper than professional rivalry. During My Fair Lady, Rex had treated Audrey with patronizing condescension, calling her the amateur behind her back, complaining to anyone who would listen that he was carrying an inexperienced girl through one of theater's greatest roles. He'd refused to help her with the vocal demands of the part, insisting that if she couldn't handle Eliza Doolittle's songs, she shouldn't have been cast. But the film had been a triumph, largely because of Audrey's luminous performance. Critics had praised her vulnerability, her transformation from flower girl to lady. Audiences had fallen in love with her authenticity, and Rex Harrison, despite winning his own accolades, had never forgiven her for succeeding where he'd expected her to fail. Now, 3 years later, watching her receive recognition for charity work, something in him snapped. The alcohol didn't help. Neither did the presence of so many industry figures who clearly adored Audrey while merely tolerating him. When Audrey's name was called, she walked to the podium with that distinctive grace, as if she were floating rather than walking. She accepted the Crystal Award from presenter Laurence Olivier, embraced him briefly, and approached the microphone. "Thank you, Larry. This is unexpected and rather overwhelming," she began, her voice soft but clear. "I'm not comfortable talking about charity work Because the moment you discuss it publicly, it stops being charity and becomes something else entirely. She paused, looking out at the crowd with those enormous dark eyes that had captivated millions. I've been fortunate in ways I never expected as a child. When you've known hunger, truly known it, you can't ignore it when you see it in others. When you've been powerless, you feel compelled to use whatever power you have to help those who have none. The audience began to applaud, but Rex Harrison's slow, mocking clap cut through the sound like a blade. The room's energy shifted instantly. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Glasses paused halfway to lips. Audrey's gaze found Rex at his table. Her expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Not fear, not anger, but a kind of quiet recognition. How perfectly predictable, Rex continued, rising to his feet with theatrical flourish. The pretty girl with the sad eyes saving the children. Tell me, Audrey, do you practice that wounded deer expression in the mirror? Or does it come naturally when you're performing compassion for the cameras? The silence that followed was absolute. Even the kitchen staff seemed to have stopped working. 200 people held their breath, waiting to see how this would unfold. Audrey stood perfectly still at the podium, her hands resting lightly on its edge. She looked at Rex with an expression that was almost serene, as if she were studying a mildly interesting specimen. Then she spoke, her voice carrying clearly through the silent ballroom, despite never rising above conversational level. Rex, I didn't realize you were here tonight. If I had, I would have prepared something more educational. She paused, and in that pause, something shifted in the room's atmosphere. You mentioned performance, which is interesting, because I've been thinking about performance a great deal lately, about the difference between performing kindness and actually living it. Rex's smirk began to fade. 3 months ago, Audrey continued, her tone remaining gentle, almost conversational. I received a call about a young actor named Michael Davies. Perhaps some of you know him. He'd been working as an extra, trying to save money for proper training. Then he was in an accident on set. A lighting rig fell, crushed his legs. He'll walk again, the doctor said, but it will take years of surgery and rehabilitation. The room was transfixed. This wasn't going where anyone had expected. Michael's family couldn't afford the medical bills. His insurance, such as it was, covered only a fraction of what he needed. He was facing a choice between bankruptcy and permanent disability. Audrey's gaze never left Rex's face. Michael had worked on several productions over the past few years. Small parts, background work, but he'd worked with many of the people in this room. Talented directors, successful producers, established actors who told him he had potential, that he should keep pursuing his dreams. Her voice remained calm, but there was something building underneath, like distant thunder. When the accident happened, Michael's mother made phone calls. She reached out to everyone her son had worked with, hoping someone might know about assistance programs, might have advice about managing the medical costs. She wasn't asking for handouts, just guidance from people who knew the industry better than she did. Rex was no longer smiling. Something in his posture suggested he knew where this was heading. The response was remarkably consistent, Audrey said, her tone still gentle but now carrying an edge as sharp as winter wind. Everyone was so sorry to hear about Michael's situation. Everyone wished him well. Everyone promised to keep him in their thoughts and prayers. And everyone, without exception, found reasons why they couldn't actually help. The silence in the room had taken on weight, pressing down on everyone present. Everyone except one person, that is. Someone Michael had never actually met. Someone who heard about the situation third hand and simply called the hospital directly. This person arranged for Michael to be transferred to a private facility with the best orthopedic surgeons in London. This person covered all medical expenses, arranged for the family's living costs during the recovery period, and established a fund to continue Michael's training once he was well enough. Audrey paused, letting the silence stretch. The interesting thing is, the person who helped Michael most had never worked with him, never met him, had no professional obligation to him whatsoever. But sometimes kindness doesn't require a connection. Sometimes it just requires recognition that someone needs help, and you have the ability to provide it. Rex had gone very pale. You see, Rex, Michael had mentioned in his thank you letter that he'd particularly enjoyed working on a production last year. Small part, just a few days of shooting, but he'd been impressed by one of the lead actors. Said this actor had taken time to talk with the extras, had been encouraging about Michael's ambitions, had even given him some advice about approaching casting directors. Audrey's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but somehow everyone heard every word. That actor was you, Rex. Michael remembered you fondly, thought you were not only talented, but genuinely kind. So when his world fell apart, when his family was desperate, his mother called your agent. 3 times. Each time she was told you were unavailable. The third time she was told to stop calling. The ballroom had become a vacuum. No one moved, no one breathed. But you weren't unavailable to attend this event tonight. You weren't too busy to come here, drink expensive champagne, and mock the idea that someone might actually help others without expecting applause. For the first time since standing up, Rex tried to speak. Audrey, I don't think you understand. I understand perfectly, she interrupted, still speaking softly, but with quiet authority that silenced him completely. I understand that genuine kindness is quiet. It doesn't require an audience. It doesn't seek recognition. It simply sees suffering and responds. She lifted the crystal award from the podium, turning it slightly so it caught the light. This award represents work I've been doing for 3 years, visiting children who are sick, frightened, dying. Families who are watching their worlds collapse around medical bills they'll never be able to pay. I don't visit these hospitals because it makes me look good. I visit them because I remember what it felt like to be powerless, to be hungry, to be afraid that no one cared whether I lived or died. Her voice carried now, not louder, but with deeper resonance. During the war, when I was starving in occupied Holland, I learned something that has shaped everything I've done since. I learned that the worst part of suffering isn't the physical pain. It's the feeling that you're invisible, that your pain doesn't matter to anyone. The kindness that saved me wasn't grand gestures or public declarations. It was small acts of recognition, a neighbor sharing a piece of bread, a stranger helping my mother find medicine, people who had nothing, giving what little they could. She looked directly at Rex, her expression infinitely sad but unforgiving. Tonight you called my work performance. You suggested I practice wounded expressions in mirrors. What you don't understand is that I'm not performing wounded. I simply remember what it feels like to be actually wounded, and I recognize that same wound in others. The silence stretched on. Rex remained standing, but his theatrical confidence had completely evaporated. There's a 7-year-old girl named Emma at Great Ormond Street, Audrey continued, her voice now carrying to every corner of the room. She's been fighting leukemia for 2 years. Her treatment has bankrupted her family. Her father stopped coming to visit because he was working 3 jobs trying to pay for her care, and it still wasn't enough. She paused, and in that pause, several people in the audience realized they were holding their breath. Last week, Emma asked me why her daddy didn't love her anymore. She thought his absence meant she had done something wrong, because when you're 7 and scared and sick, you blame yourself for everything. Audrey's composure never wavered, but her words carried the weight of absolute truth. I told Emma that her daddy loved her more than anything in the world, that he was working so hard to help her get better that he'd forgotten to show her how much he cared. Then I made sure her father could cut his hours and spend time with her. I made sure her treatment would continue regardless of cost, not because it makes me a saint, but because no 7-year-old should ever think she's not worthy of love. She set the award back down on the podium with infinite care. That's not performance, Rex. That's memory. That's recognition. That's the understanding that suffering is universal, but so is the capacity to ease it. The room remained absolutely still. Rex was standing at his table, but he looked smaller somehow, diminished. You want to know the difference between us? Audrey asked, and for the first time, there was something almost like pity in her voice. It's not talent. It's not training. It's not even opportunity. The difference is that I remember what it feels like to need help and have no one offer it. And you apparently have forgotten. She picked up the crystal award one final time. Thank you for this recognition. I hope it encourages others to find their own quiet ways of helping. Not for awards, not for applause, but because kindness is the only response to suffering that actually matters. Audrey walked off the stage to complete silence. For nearly 10 seconds, no one moved. Then someone in the back began to applaud. Others joined. Within moments, the entire room was standing, applauding with genuine emotion rather than polite obligation. Everyone was standing except Rex Harrison, who remained frozen at his table, the weight of his own cruelty finally visible to himself and everyone around him. The next morning, newspapers across London carried the story, but more importantly, Great Ormond Street Hospital received 37 calls from people offering to volunteer, to donate, to help in whatever way they could. Michael Davies' recovery fund received anonymous contributions totaling more than £50,000. And Rex Harrison spent the longest 3 days of his life realizing that he had confused performance with authenticity for so long that he'd forgotten the difference entirely. On the fourth day, he appeared at Audrey's door in Belgravia, not with flowers or apologies, but with a simple request. "Teach me," he said. She looked at him for a long moment, this man who had mocked her, dismissed her, tried to humiliate her in front of everyone they both knew. Then she stepped aside and invited him in. "The first thing you need to understand," she said as they sat in her garden, "is that kindness isn't about you. It's not about how you feel or what you get in return. It's about recognizing that other people's pain is real, and if you have the ability to ease it, you do." Rex Harrison learned to be quiet. He learned to listen. He learned to help without needing acknowledgement. But more than anything, he learned the difference between performing goodness and living it. Years later, when both their careers had become footnotes to larger legacies, Rex would tell people that Audrey Hepburn hadn't humiliated him at the Dorchester Hotel that night. She had saved him, not with cruelty, not with revenge, but with the simple, devastating power of authentic compassion demonstrated so clearly that his own emptiness became impossible to ignore. That perhaps was the greatest performance of her career, making goodness so compelling that even those who had forgotten how to be good remembered they wanted to try.